Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of the Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are talking about what genealogy records exist anywhere in the world. Now, those of you who've been with me for a while know that I've covered some version of this topic multiple times over the last 6 years. We've talked about the card catalog, we've talked about the Family History Wiki, but there have been some changes, and so I just wanted to refresh the topic, make sure that you got the most up-to-date information. For those of you who are brand new to my show, you may not have heard anything about the card catalog before. You may not be at all familiar with the Family History Wiki. And in fact, I get questions every day through email and on Facebook and Twitter, people asking me, well, does Ancestry have records for such and such a place? Or where do I go if I'm trying to find my grandfather's birth certificate? So that's what we're going to cover today, is what genealogy records exist in the world and how you can find out where to find them. Hopefully that is of interest to you. Let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, so before we can talk about what genealogy records exist in the world, one of the things you have to be really clear about is, what is your research question? If you, for example, are looking for your great-grandfather's birth certificate, which is one of the things I see a lot of people do. They think, oh, I need to know his birth date or his parents' names, so I need to find his birth certificate. That's not really the research question. What the research question is what is my great-grandfather's birth date? Or who are my great-grandfather's parents? It's best if you get really specific about what your research question is. What piece of information are you trying to discover about a particular ancestor or someone in your family tree? When you get really specific about that, it allows you to do the next thing really well, which is ask yourself what records might help answer that research question. So, again, if my question is, what is my great-grandfather's birth date? And that's my very specific research question, then a birth certificate would certainly be on that list. But there are other records that exist that might have his birth date on it. For example, his marriage license might have his age. His census records would also have his age. His military enlistment might have his birth date. His death certificate likely has his birth date. His tombstone and obituary. So you see, you're starting to get all of these ideas of the kinds of records that exist that might have the same information on it. Now, there's two reasons why that's important. The first reason is because in family history, we have this concept called a reasonably exhaustive search. One of the things that you'll realize very quickly, if you haven't already, is that not all records that we use for family history research are accurate. For example, just because something is engraven on stone on a tombstone does not make it correct. It's only as accurate as the information that was provided. Just because something is on a federal census record doesn't mean it is correct. It's only as accurate as the information provided to the census taker by the random family member or neighbor or whoever happened to provide that information. So the idea is, in family history, we collect all the records about a person that answers a specific research question, and then we correlate all of that evidence to come to a conclusion. So if your research question is, what is great-grandpa's birth date? A list of all the possible records that would have that on it is important. The second reason why making a list like this is important is because certain records that you expect to find or that you think should exist don't always exist. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes it's because birth certificates weren't required prior to a certain date in a certain place where your ancestor may have lived. Or maybe the marriage records for a particular county were all destroyed in a fire, or any other number of reasons. So making a complete list of what records might help answer your very specific research question becomes a really useful process to engage in. Now, I have done this long enough, I've been doing family history research long enough that I don't always write this list out. it's become kind of instinctual in my head. I know what records I should be looking for. But if you're new to family history, it's super useful to just get out a piece of paper and actually start writing those things down. Now, if I'm working on a really massive research project or if I have a lot going on, I will still sometimes write out this list of possible records so that I can check them off as I find them. I used to use a spreadsheet to do that process. I've used scrap paper, and I still do sometimes use the actual notes feature in my family tree. That feature is available both in your Ancestry online tree and in most genealogy software programs. And so I'll do some of it there. And then I've also started playing around with doing it in my bullet journal. So I'm a bullet journaler for the rest of my life to keep it all straight. And I've been really playing around with lots of different low-tech ways to use my bullet journal to help me keep track of my research process. As a matter of fact, I'm doing an entire presentation at Roots Tech on bullet journaling for family history. And so if you're going to be there, you might want to come see me in that class. After the class, I'll be sure to share some tips for those of you who weren't able to participate. I'll do that over on my Instagram channel at Crista Cowan, and I'll share some of those tips both on my feed, my Instagram feed, as well as through my Insta stories. But that'll be after Roots Tech. I just want to make sure that the people that are paying to come to Roots Tech get the first look at some of those. Plus, I'm still refining some of those habits of what to keep track of in my bullet journal as it relates to my family history research and what not to. Okay, so once you've defined the very specific research question and you've made a list of the possible records that will help answer that question, then the next natural question is, does the record you need exist? And that is a really interesting question. Like I said, we don't always know what records exist for specific time periods and places in the world until we start digging into it. Now, if you've been doing research for a very long time in Georgia, for example, you start to develop the knowledge about what records exist for what counties and what records don't. But if you have just traced your family into Virginia, and that is the first time you've started researching in Virginia records, it might be a really good exercise to familiarize yourself with what records exist for Virginia. Or if you're brand new to family history and your parents are immigrants from Ireland or from China or from Germany or from Uganda, like wherever in the world, it might be really useful to familiarize yourself with what records exist in the world. And then the next natural question that flows from that is, if the record exists, where can I find that record? Because just because a record exists doesn't mean that that record exists online. So, two things to keep in mind. One is that historical records don't exist for everyone everywhere. And that's just a sad fact of reality. There have been fires and natural disasters and man-made disasters and wars and all of the things that cause records to be destroyed over history. There are also many cultures where records were never created to begin with, and that is true all over the world for various periods of time. So for example, my grandfather was born in the 1920s in Arkansas, and as far as we can tell, there was no state-level birth record created for him. He was likely born at home. The country doctor came around later, so the record we have of his birth is actually from the family Bible. And then there was a recording that was made in the doctor's notes when he came around, when the country doctor came around once a month or however often he came around, that a child had been born. So there's not always a birth certificate or even a death certificate filed for everyone everywhere throughout the history of time. So that's something that a lot of people who are new to family history find a little bit shocking. And when they start, coming into Facebook groups or sending emails or calling Ancestry to find out, how do I find this record? It's often a shock to them to start to realize that not all records exist for everyone everywhere. So that's an important thing to keep in mind. And then the second thing to keep in mind is that not all records are online. So Ancestry for the last several years has been digitizing an average of 2 million records a day. We did about 2 million records a month for almost 2 decades, and then we've sped that process up and been able to optimize a lot of our processes for digitizing records. And so a lot of records are online, and certainly enough records for many people to get started. But again, not all records are online, and there's a lot of reasons for that. Sometimes it's just because we haven't gotten around to digitizing them yet. Sometimes it's because the government or the organization that holds those records in whatever country is not allowing people to come in and access those records in order to digitize them and put them online. So lots of different reasons why records might not all be online, but the best place to start is online to see what records might exist. So here is my process for how I go to see what records exist online. And then if they don't exist online, I try to figure out where I can find them. My first stop always is the Ancestry Card Catalog. If you're not familiar with the card catalog, you access it by clicking on the search menu item on Ancestry and then going to the card catalog. So I'm going to click here on search, and then if I scroll down here on this menu to the card catalog, that's going to bring me here. Now the card catalog on Ancestry, much like a card catalog in a library, is a listing of all of the, in this case, databases, not books, of all of the databases of records that are online at Ancestry. So at this point in time, there's 32,673 of those databases. You can sort this various ways. I tend to like to use the record count sort because that puts the largest databases at the top of the list. You can see here 1.8 billion historical 1.8 billion people in family trees on Ancestry, 1.5 billion records in U.S. city directories, 418 million in the Public Records Index, and so on. So you can see the record count over here if you've sorted by that. You can also sort this list by database title. So that just throws everything into alphabetical order, and you can see what has been digitized that way. So like I said, I tend to use the record count as my sort the most often. Then I use this title field for my searches, and I'll give you a little tip here. I typically will only search by the name of the country, the name of the state or county, and then the name of a more specific location, but I do it in that order. So for example, if I am interested in research for the state of Virginia, I would type in the word Virginia, and then you'll see here I now only have 685 databases represented out of the 32,000 plus, because those are the ones that have the word Virginia in the title of the database. Now, I could further filter that list over here on the left-hand side. I can filter by record type, and then I can filter by either century or decade. So for example, if I was interested in birth records for Virginia in the 1870s, I could click on that and it would show me there are 104 databases of records that contain birth records for Virginia for that time period. Now, because I've got it sorted by record count over here, I can just look at the largest database here, has 9 million plus records in it, and it includes delayed birth records from 1854 to 1911. Now, if you're not familiar with delayed birth records, here's a little sidebar. Essentially, if the birth was not recorded at the time of birth, but if at some later point in that person's life they needed a birth record to apply for Social Security or to go into the military or whatever other reason they may have needed a birth record, they could get an affidavit from someone who is present at the birth or who has known them since birth and submit that in order to get a delayed birth record recorded at the state. And several states have made those available to Ancestry. And so this particular database contains that. Now, this is a perfect example of why a birth record might not exist for someone who was born before 1912. And that is because if they didn't ever have a need to apply for a delayed birth record, their birth would not have been registered with the state. Now, that said, there are, you'll notice, several databases of county birth records. So at least here in the United States, prior to state laws requiring recording of births, lots of counties recorded births in whatever fashion. Now, of course, Virginia was subject to a lot of ravages during the Civil War here in the United States, and so you'll notice that some of these databases only date back to the mid-1860s, and that's often because there were entire courthouses, county courthouses, that were burned or destroyed during the Civil War. Sometimes they were just burned or destroyed because of whatever other disaster came through that particular area. And sometimes the databases don't start until that date because that's just when the state, let me rephrase that, when the county was created or just when they chose to start recording those particular records. So becoming familiar with all of the little nuances here is kind of a useful thing, especially if you're doing research for the first time in a particular county or location. Now, one of the things that I strongly recommend is every time you come to a new database that you've never used before, scroll down past that search box and just read the information in the database description. Sometimes it's very limited information. Sometimes it's very extensive information. It just depends on what was provided to Ancestry about that particular set of records. So that'll help you become more familiar with the records and give you an opportunity to make the educated choices about how you search that particular database. So if you know the ins and outs of the records, the more you know that, the more effective your search strategies are going to be, and the more effective or the more positive your search results are going to be. So again, you can do this type of search. Let me clear my search results there in the card catalog with any location in the world. So France, 132 databases. I could narrow it down by record type if I so choose. Michigan, again, right? Sometimes I'm interested in a state. Germany, sometimes I'm interested in a country. And that's, again, one of the top questions we get here at Ancestry every day is, does Ancestry have records for X place? Well, come to the card catalog, you can search that information out for yourself. Now, if you find one of these databases and you have additional questions about that, by all means, feel free to leave a comment here on the YouTube channel or reach out to us through the Ancestry Facebook page. We do respond to those messages and we'll try to provide you with some assistance around the context of those records if you're not terribly familiar with them or want some more information than what's provided in that database description. But that's how you search the card catalog. Hopefully that makes sense. If you have any questions, like I said, feel free to leave those there. So the card catalog will always tell you what records are available on Ancestry. Now, if you've done a search and the record is not available on Ancestry, the other resource that I'm going to direct you to is the Family History Wiki. Now, the Family History Wiki used to reside on Ancestry in the Learning Center, but with some changes in the Learning Center and shifting over from the Learning Center to the Support Center, the Family History Wiki went away for a while. And it has now been revived and moved over to RootsWeb. For those of you who are not familiar with RootsWeb, RootsWeb is the largest free community of family history resources on the internet, and it is owned by Ancestry. It still is in existence. There's been some premature rumors of its demise. So RootsWeb still exists at rootsweb.com, and if you just type in wiki.rootsweb.com, you will get there. You can see here in the URL at the top of my screen, wiki.rootsweb.com, and that will bring you to this page. Now, it is a wiki, so it's not terribly pretty, but it has all of the necessary features to help you make some discoveries. Now, the wiki, I will say right up front here, is specific to US-based family history research. So if you're interested in research for Poland or research for Italy or research for Brazil or whatever the case may be, I would suggest using your favorite search engine. I'm a Google user myself. Use your favorite search engine and just Google Polish genealogy or Brazilian genealogy. And there are tons of resources available online. Lots of really great genealogists, people who have been doing this for decades, who have collected resources. Another one of my favorite resources is Cindy's List. And that's C-Y-N-D-I, Cindy's, cindy'slist.com. She has collected and continues to collect genealogy links from all over the web. So if you don't want to do Google search and have to weed through your own search results, you can go to cindy'slist.com, and she has everything categorized beautifully. So the idea here, though, on the wiki, if you're doing US-based research, is we have 2 books that have been published for decades, and the latest editions of those books were then digitized and placed online in a wiki format, and then they have been updated over the years with current information. So the first is the source. So the source is simply what it says. It's a guidebook to American genealogy. And if you scroll down here, you're going to see the table of contents, and you'll notice that it is broken out by record type. So for example, if you're interested in vital records, those are birth, marriage, and death records, or if you're interested in immigration records, so passenger lists and naturalization and passports and any kind of immigration record, if you're interested in church records or censuses or court records, if you just want to learn more about the record types that exist in the world of genealogy here in the United States, then these articles are going to be super useful for you. Every article is written by a professional genealogist who specializes in that record type. So these are people who have dedicated their entire careers to knowing all the ins and outs of these kinds of records. And so there's some really great information. You'll notice down here in the bottom of the table of contents, you'll also see different types of research, not just different record types. So African American research, colonial English, colonial Spanish, Hispanic, Jewish, Native American, and urban gets its own category, because researching in big cities is often very different than the kind of research that you do if your family was a farmer from somewhere in the Midwest. So that is super useful. And then down below that, you're going to see some appendix items, and in the appendix you're going to have abbreviations and acronyms. That's a useful thing to read through as you start to dive into family history and become part of the Ancestry family, and as you're building your family tree and you start maybe interacting in some of the Facebook groups and pages or going to a local genealogy society meeting. Sometimes as genealogists, we throw around a lot of acronyms and we forget that those of you who are newer or newish might not understand what those mean. And so there's a list of those. We also have lists of genealogical societies. Those are really useful for people who want to meet with people who are local to where they live on a once a month usually basis, and learn some things and talk about family history and help each other out. Lots of other resources available there, but this is the source, and I encourage you to click through and explore that a little bit. Then, very pertinent to our topic today, the other book on the wiki is called The Red Book. So the source is organized by record type to tell you what types of records have been created for various things over time and where to find those records. The Red Book is organized by state, and then within each state, it's organized further by record type, and then it has information about the counties as well. So we'll click through here to Alabama as an example. So this will give you a brief history about Alabama and how that relates to family history. You'll see a map with all of the counties. Those of us who've been doing family history for a while recognize the importance of maps and understanding where we can put our family members on a piece of dirt somewhere in the world, that's important, because proximity matters when you start looking for your family members. You want to make sure you're not confusing them with someone of the same name who may have lived 3 or 4 counties away. You also want to just understand, did they live near a border? Were the borders changing around them? Did they really always live in Alabama, or maybe they were sometimes recorded in records in Georgia because the county they lived on was, right there on the border, and maybe the borders changed over time. So lots of maps are super useful, and this just gives you a broad overview of the counties. And then again, down here on the right-hand side, you're going to see some click-through links. We've got that same structure in the source, and you'll be able to see specific information about record type for that state. So just because a certain record type might exist in Georgia doesn't mean that that same record type exists in Alabama, and so that can give you some details about that. And then those articles also include information about what counties started keeping records at what time, and so what records exist at different periods of time. So hopefully that all made sense. Again, if you have questions, feel free to leave them here as a comment on this video here on YouTube. But just to reiterate, when you're in the card catalog, you're going to search by country or by state, and then maybe by county or a specific location. So always start broad and then narrow it down as you become familiar with what records exist. I will tell you the card catalog is also a great way to just jump directly to a specific database that you want to search. When you do a global search on Ancestry, it searches all 22 billion historical records, and sometimes that list of search results is a little bit overwhelming. And so when I'm looking for a specific record type off of my list that I've made because of my research question, I usually will just go to the card catalog, find the database that holds the record I'm looking for, and search that way instead of searching everything. And then the other tip is in the card catalog, you also don't have to search by location at all. As a matter of fact, you don't have to search at all. You can just use the filters down the left-hand side and filter down to a specific record type and a specific time period, and then look through or browse through those different locations to see if the records that you are looking for even exist. So hopefully that all made sense. That is all I have prepared for you today. Again, if you have questions, feel free to leave them as comments. If you have suggestions for topics for future videos, you can email me at ask@ancestry.com with those suggestions. And then, as I mentioned earlier, if you are interested in following me on Instagram at Crista Cowan, you can reach me there, and I do occasionally share family history tips and tricks that are a little bit shorter than what a YouTube video might be worth creating over on my Insta stories. Until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.